Hello everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the All Words Are Free podcast. So before we get into today's topic, we're going to do a mandatory outfit of the day. My friend gave me an idea to actually put photos on of my outfit of the day, which I think might be quite nice. And yeah, it'd be nice to get some more feedback as well. Let me know what you think of this and the outfit of the day thing in general. If we like it, or if we don't, just let me know. So today I'm wearing a sort of white, I'm trying to think of the word, because it's not mesh, but it's like a semi-see-through sort of fabric. But it's not see-through to the extent of you don't have to wear anything under it. It's a play suit, but it looks like a dress. It's white with blue flowers on, as you can see. And obviously, actually putting the photos on is going to really cut down the describing time. So that's quite good. And then I'm just wearing white sneakers. And there we go. And got my jewellery and my sunglasses because it's very hot. It's been very hot this week. Finally, summer has arrived and I've just moved into my new flat. So it's a week of a lot of new things. It can get quite overwhelming because it's a lot of new things are going on at the same time, but in the same way I feel really good and I'm really excited for what's in store. And on the theme of what's new today, what's new this week's episode is going to be about grief. The quote that has inspired today's episode: "We have to live each day because they can't." So this is quite a heavy topic, but I feel right now this is a good time to speak about it. I think also being able to see the lighter side of grief, it's a really important thing to be able to assess and look at. I'm going to be approaching from a slightly sort of scientific side and things that obviously occur to your body, as well as looking at culture and media, looking at grief, as well as my own emotions and the feelings of it all. So as well as generally just wanting to talk about this topic, my core inspiration was actually the latest season of Doctor Who. I know, please. I've been really, really loving this season. I haven't watched it for a long time. So when I was little, David Tennant was sort of my doctor, per se. And I sort of just watched it from then on. I hadn't watched it for a little bit. I watched Peter Capaldi and then Jodie Whittaker to really watch it. I just didn't watch it for a while. And then with Ncuti Gatwa, I was like, okay, let's give it a go. Let's try it again. And honestly, this recent season has been incredible. I think from about episode 3, it really started going up. I think the first couple of episodes were slightly mechanical or a bit of a duff episodes, not quite getting into it. But from the third episode onwards, I love how this season is tackling really serious or big issues. I love any sort of media or popular media that covers those things, because as you can probably tell already, I'm a commentary freak. So anything social, political or culture orientated, I love it. And I love something that can promote a discussion while in that popular format. So you can take from it what you will. I think Ncuti Gatwa is amazingly skilled. Facial expressions, the way he speaks and the mannerisms of the Doctor and the charisma is insane. And I also really like Millie Gibson. She's just very down to earth, and I like the northern representation as well, of course. But yeah, I really like the thread as well of Ruby's story, and obviously in the final couple of episodes stuff comes to a head. So on the theme of grief, I'm going to focus on a couple of the episodes. Rogue, which was the episode with Jonathan Groff. I think this, as well as Bridgerton, which slay, this looked at the grief behind losing someone you've just met or maybe just formed a connection with, also with a lover or a partner. But I think there was a glimmer of hope. There's a slight suspicion there that Jonathan Groff's going to come back. I hope he comes back because I really like the character. I guess I kind of covered the grief behind losing someone even if they're not gone per se. The idea of maybe separating from friends at the end of a stint at university, or separating from a family member who you might not see again. It's one of those things where it's still grief. It doesn't have to be a bereavement for you to feel that weighty emotion of loss. And there's still that hope of somebody being there. So I guess it's easier to get through or sort of cope with. But it's still very upsetting. Recently, it's the end of the summer term at university, and so a lot of people have actually graduated this year or are leaving. So I get that emotion at the moment, that sort of feeling of, it hasn't fully dawned on me yet, but that you're not going to see a lot of these people again. And there is that slight feeling of loss that, wow, that's it. And it's very sad. And it's not that I'm never going to see them again, but there's just that feeling where they're not going to be right there. They're not going to be as tangible. Because I'm not a massive texter or anything like that on group chats. So I very much like to speak to people in person. And I think this group of friends that I've established within my time at university are some of the closest friends that I've ever made and I'm probably ever going to have. And so I'm going to stay connected with a lot of them, but there's making the effort, but it's not as easy as just knowing that you're going to be seeing them on X day in person because you're both going to X place or things like that. It's kind of sad, and yeah, I'm gonna miss a lot of them. Looking at Doctor Who still, the episode where the father steps on a landmine, I'm terribly sorry, I can't remember what the episode is called, but it covers a couple of kinds of grief. There's the idea of the fear of losing someone, because obviously the Doctor steps on a landmine, and then there's those feelings in Ruby of something could happen and I'm just waiting for it to happen, the adrenaline rush. Also, Ruby is obviously shot, so there's the fear there of losing her. And this is also covered in the musical episode as well, The Beatles, the fear of losing her. And so there's that idea of you're almost waiting for it, you're suspended and you're waiting for it to happen. And that's incredibly scary. It's very, very scary because you haven't quite lost the person yet and you're just on the cusp of despair, and there's just that little bit of hope that you're clinging on to, and it's terrifying to know that you're about to lose someone or the time is ticking away and it's coming, or it may not, but the fear is all the same. It's a very active and present fear, rather than maybe after a bereavement where the weight of grief and obviously the stages of grief, it's that more weighted, continual grief, underbelly emotion where little things will set you off, little triggers, little items that were theirs or things like that. And there's that underlying feeling of despair and sadness. There's also a remembrance there, which is quite reflective and positive in the way of remembering things and looking at memories, keeping alive who they were. So, for example, in the episode of Doctor Who, they're referring to the idea that the daughter is the continuation of the father, the man that she lost. The father sacrificed himself for her continuation, for her life. And there's that idea of the more optimistic or joyous side of grief. The idea that by keeping their hopes or by keeping their outlook alive through the people closest to them, they have that legacy. And there's no pressure, obviously, to continue a legacy. You can't put pressure on yourself like that. It's a very reflective and sad but calm mode of reflection. It's quite uplifting in a strange way. A link to Jonathan Groff, side note, I was in a production of Spring Awakening. Jonathan Groff is the original Melchior. And it's interesting, so during the actual show, I was always getting changed during Don't Do Sadness, the song. But that song, when I was listening to the soundtrack after the show, it came to me at a time that I needed a song to tell me how I felt. And I think that's what's so magical about artistic expression, whether it be songs, whether it be writing, whether it be audio. You can't quite put into words how you feel, but somebody says it and it just all feels very accurate to your own experience. And I think with Don't Do Sadness, it was the idea of the grief or the loss of self. The idea that after a bereavement or after a loss, you kind of lose that connection to yourself slightly because yourself and your day-to-day things that lighten you or things you enjoy, it all seems slightly detached, it all seems slightly distant. But in listening to this song, it just sort of helped me come to terms with, yeah, this is how I'm feeling, and sometimes you've got to sit in that for a bit, and it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to not be thriving or in your best, working your best every day, because that's not natural anyway, never mind after a bereavement. You give yourself that space. And the song It's Quiet Uptown from Hamilton had that similar thing for me, especially after a bereavement. That song, it's interesting because the song still brings back those feelings when I listen to it. It could be the brightest, sunniest day and I'm having the best day and things are going great and whatever. And the power of a song is so wonderful because you listen to it and it just instantly brings back the feelings that it roused in you the first time. And It's Quiet Uptown really gave me that release. And I was listening to it while I was walking and I got back to where I was living and I just cried. But it was so relieving. And it's almost magical how the words of others can help you yourself process or just give yourself some space. And that's another thing I want to sort of talk about or go on to. You don't need to keep it in. A lot of the time, you don't want to talk about it because you're either pushing it away or you're not necessarily consciously pushing something away, but you're just not reflecting on it or recognising it because you just want to carry on. And sometimes that's what's needed. Sometimes you just need to keep going and stay on track, and that's how some people deal with things. That's how I deal with things. I just keep going. And to a certain extent, this can not be the healthiest thing. And I think not keeping it in by just speaking to people or speaking to yourself and just reflecting yourself, just reading their favourite book or listening to their favourite song or looking at photographs. I read something on someone's Substack page. It's called The Beautiful Chaos. It's linked below. And there was a quote in there in one of the article essays that went, "I don't want the feelings to be numbed away." And it really struck me because it's very true. It's very accurate that if you're pushing away those feelings and not recognising them, maybe that's not the best thing, and maybe not numbing them and then allowing yourself to feel those emotions, that's the best way to keep going and get past it. or to keep going and allow that grief to become part of you. Because after a very close bereavement, there is a form of permanent change in the self. At least in my experience, I feel that I'm changed, or I look at life differently now that I have experienced a very close bereavement. So another Substack article around this topic, and that will also be linked below, was written by my friend Beau, and this is the Letting It Linger page on Substack. The name of the article begins with, "Grief is what got me out of bed." They have such a wonderful style, and I think one thing that really struck me in this piece particularly was the idea of anniversaries. When an anniversary for a bereavement comes around, it can be very difficult. And I think sometimes, say for example, an anniversary comes around for somebody else who I know or I'm close to, there's these conflicting feelings, right? You want to comfort them, but in the same way you don't want to mention it if they're preferring to avoid direct or outright questions. So I sort of acknowledge to a point, obviously I remember, but I'm aware that I don't want to make it into a thing, because if somebody's, sensitive, you don't want to mention it and it maybe ruins their day. Maybe they're just trying to enjoy the day. You could see people that you're grieving on that particular day and all the little things. For me, I carry on. I don't really acknowledge anniversaries on the surface level. I think these times come around and these times go, and I think ultimately, for me, it sits as a date. There's to somebody's graveside and dropping flowers, or remembering them in conversations that you have with other people. Reflecting, I think for me, is definitely a continuation of that original grief. And I think even these maybe more transient feelings of grief, or these transient amplifications in our grief at these particular times, can be very reflective and made into quite positive. Another thing mentioned in this article is the concept of the push to keep going. So even if you're not feeling too good, you keep going and keep going. This idea of like a cloaked hurt. And I definitely do this, almost to the point where you keep going and you keep going and you keep going, and then you hit that wall and then you're unable to do any more. It's so difficult to navigate because you almost can't stop yourself from that push to keep going. You will just continue, and you won't even realise your own emotions, or you'll ignore them, even subconsciously, until there's a little trigger and something happens and it does set you off. Grief felt very much like that for me. But also, another concept was the idea that we cannot sit in our grief, otherwise we will never continue. I think we can't let our grief overwhelm us to a certain point. I think obviously you need to process things and discuss and remember, but by sitting in grief for so long, it becomes detrimental to ourselves, and that is not what that person would have wanted. Sometimes maintaining a routine is what you need to do to keep going, as I mentioned before, and having that routine allows you to get out of bed in the morning. It allows you to process and to be with others in your grief. Having people there also gives you that drive to go on. Meeting with friends, which is something that Beau mentions. There's those moments of light and those things to aim for. And I think having those aims is a beautiful way. So taking a turn slightly into the more cultural or social side, I've always been told that children's first exposure to death is through the loss of a pet. So obviously not always, but the idea of the death of a pet is like a lesson in grief. I suppose it's sort of like an introductory step. Obviously, the death of a pet isn't the same. It's not going to fully prepare you, for example, for the loss of a loved one. family or a friend, because the connection you have with a pet isn't the same as the connection with another human being. Although I never actually had any pets, so maybe I'm wrong, you can tell me differently. I think the first human death that you experience, it's inevitable and it's heartbreaking. But having those early exposures will definitely add some sort of buffer or allow you to feel and then acknowledge why you're feeling that way. Perhaps this sadness that's maybe blanketing your days in that moment. You know what this is. I think for me, obviously not having a pet, I didn't know this deep grief until I lost my grandpa. And as I mentioned before, it truly has changed me. And I think looking back now, I really did go through a long time of just moments, little glimmers of feeling really low. It was a time where I wasn't sure where I was going, what I was doing. I was keeping going, but I could tell, I'd look back on my essays for assignments and just think like, what the hell is this? My thoughts were not in the present. And it's funny how hindsight really, really shows us these things. There's also a lot of different types of grief. There's a tangible grief of the others around you. The idea that you yourself are not grieving, but you hurt to see the grief of others. And maybe that brings back some memories for you. So it's interesting how we can interact with each other's grief and help each other through each other's grief. There's impersonal grief as well, these small moments of grief for a celebrity or a figurehead. Maybe it's a great change, like the death of a monarch, or maybe it's a change that maybe touches you, and say the death of an actor who was this particular character that you really identified with in your favourite film, or the death of somebody who was an activist or was very vocal in a particular issue that is close to your heart. You feel saddened by the fact that the world doesn't have them anymore, perhaps, but you also, it's like this general sense of grief or this general sadness ever around us in our experiences of life, that is death, and perhaps the loss of a public figure that impacts you in some way is a little segment of sadness that is part of us. Alright, so I said at the start about taking the science side, and now we are taking the science side. So, it's really intriguing to, obviously there's all the emotional and the changes in the brain. And these changes in the brain can influence our entire body. So as a biochemist, by principle, some of the physical symptoms that can afflict us when we're grieving, obviously stress. So our stress levels will go up, and this is why things that wouldn't annoy you normally or frustrate you normally become amplified. For example, you go to your favourite coffee shop and turns out they're closed for the day. On a normal day, you may just think, oh well, I'll go somewhere else. But when you're sitting in that grief and your stress levels are already high, it really frustrates you. Maybe it's knocked out your routine. So what are you going to do? And you start panicking or overthinking, or maybe you just cry. And to the outside spectator, that may look a bit odd, a bit overreactive. But to you, that is everything. It's funny how changes in our body and our brain can really make a difference. And they can impact each other, like a sort of chicken and egg situation. Stress will quite literally change the proteins that our body makes, and it will also change the ways in which our body's cells are acting, their behaviour. The Beautiful Chaos Substack that I mentioned before covers a lot of these things in one of their articles. which I thought was very interesting. And it's nice to see the science side alongside the more emotional, perhaps, side, because I suppose science can be very clinical and dissecting in its outlook. The writer goes on to say about how one may be very energetic or feel on edge or hyper, and that's that adrenaline rush. And then suddenly there's a crash and the emotional burden is suddenly there, and that's weighing you down. Exhaustion is a massive thing when you're grieving. You feel like you can't lift yourself out of it, and then that is that feeling of maybe, oh, well, I should be doing more. And there's such a thing in our current society and in what's expected of people, that people should be working, that people should be achieving all of the time. And this can be very toxic, especially when people are going through very difficult times. Another interesting thing is the idea of periodic grief. So you get these emotions that pop up like an anniversary, like when you see something that reminds you of them, and then you suddenly have a couple days where you're really feverish, or you feel nauseous or exhausted, you feel stressed, your nervous system is all over the place, and that is the reaction to the emotional weight and therefore the hormones that are flooding through your body. There's also the bodily effects of the shock when you suddenly lose somebody. A sudden loss versus, say, for example, a prolonged loss or a expected loss. No form of grief is superior or more than the other. Grief is such a multifaceted thing, and different people will also respond very differently. There's no one physiological effect per se. Some people will have different manifestations. Some people will have some of these symptoms, not all of these symptoms. Some people have pre-existing conditions, and in which case these can be exacerbated. Say, for example, somebody has high blood pressure already, their blood pressure would raise even further. I think it's important to remember that people deal with grief in a lot of different ways. And so if somebody seems very absent or numb, or even like they're not acknowledging it at all, and they're, going out to parties, maybe that's just how they process it. There's no one way that is better than the other, and we should just give people grace and allow them their space and their own license to process their grief. As flipping the script a little from science, the supernatural is very interesting when considering, say, a recent bereavement or even a previous or past bereavement. There's an element of that we don't really know. And then there's also an element of, well, perhaps we simply see what we wish for. Perhaps we're just seeing what's already sitting in our mind. We manifest it to our eyes when it isn't actually there. There's that hope. The hope that they're actually still there out there, they're watching over us, they're still present in our lives, whoever that may be. It's the idea of human connection, that the grief you feel for them is reciprocated in some way. I might be reading a scientific journal, which is something that my grandpa always used to read to me when I was little. And I might see a motion behind me. A shadow, if you will. Maybe it's a bit of hair. Maybe it's just my imagination. Maybe my mind is showing me what I want to see, that he's watching me, keeping our little traditions alive. On an emotional level, it didn't matter to me, or it doesn't matter to me whether he's actually there or not. It's more about that memory's there. Those thoughts of him are there while I'm reading these journals. And maybe that is the magic behind it, behind what we call the supernatural. Those thoughts and those memories that manifest that person before us. And so here we are, the final segment. We're going to talk about the future. What comes after, and what comes far after a bereavement. As I said, I feel from my personal experience that I am changed forever, that my most recent bereavement I've reflected on things, or I am permanently changed. I'm permanently different to how I was before, and that's not better or worse, that's just fact. You never get over it, as the common phrase says, but you can go on. You don't need to get over your grief. You grow alongside it. You live alongside it. There are so many different types of grief that we all experience, whether frequently or infrequently. I've sort of realised, it's actually in my conversation with Beau, whose Substack is below. In my pursuits of journalism and scientific journalism, in my pursuits of writing, and even in this podcast, my path is similar to my grandpa's, and in a few ways, it's strange and very comforting. I don't think his passing forced me into this, and my way of dealing with it is leaping into what he did out of in an unwilling way. I don't think it helped me realise, I don't even know whether I can say it helped me realise quicker, but perhaps it gave me that gauge of, this isn't endless. Perhaps it allowed me to look at what I was doing and think, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm going to do what he maybe promised was out there for me. I read a lot of his old writings for the first time, and to be honest, I didn't really know they existed until after he passed away. And reading them and seeing that side of him when he was about my age or slightly older, I truly see myself in that. And it's incredible. I didn't know how like him I am. Even though we were different in many ways, and we were close in a somewhat academically charged way. We were close in a somewhat extra familial way. We were family, and the word kin comes to mind in the way that we were similar in more ways that I even realised. Maybe he even realised. The more time that passes, almost the closer I feel to him. I feel almost closer to him now because his world has opened up to me in the form of his writing. I am like the genetic and physical legacy, and perhaps that is how we remember. The people that we lose live within us. All of the people around us influence who we are, and therefore influence our reactions to the world, our day-to-day interactions with others. And so they live through our everyday and through everyone we get to know. Thank you all for listening. I hope you liked this episode, and I'll see you soon for another one. Have a lovely day, and let's